Okay, so now we're going to talk about page 9 and 10 of the purchase contract, L-1 through N-3. So the first section, section L, covers the termite provisions of the contract. And basically this first section talks about that buyers aware that termite inspection reports are based on the inspector being able to access, only be able to do a report on areas that are accessible. Sometimes termite inspectors go into properties where they're not able to get to certain sections of the house, either because it's a storage area, maybe there's a lot of things in a storage locker, and there's locked places or places that are really hard to get to. There are certain times where they are not able to do a report on certain parts of the house, and this is just a disclaimer of that. L2 is the termite inspection contingency itself, and this first box talks about how long the buyer has to let the seller know who the buyer wants to use for the termite company. Typically, the buyer is the one that selects the termite company, and the seller is typically the one that usually pays for it. Sometimes the seller may already have a termite inspection report that the buyer may or may not potentially want to accept, in which case you could just go ahead and put the seller to select, and then you would take their report. Sometimes we'll do this when we have a backup offer situation where you know you're going to be getting a termite inspection report with the first offer, and the second backup offer position may want to go ahead and just accept that inspection report. But we're just going to talk about the basics here, and the basics are within typical 5 days of acceptance, the buyer shall select the termite company. And then the next box here is how long the seller has to deliver that report to the buyer. So typically we like to do this 14 days prior to closing, because if it is subject to a loan, lenders don't like to see anything longer than 2 weeks, because a termite inspection report really is only good for 2 weeks. So if you've got a lender requesting a termite inspection report and you give it to them too soon, it will have expired by the time loan approval is due, and they'll want you to do an update. It's very important that you do that, because if you don't and you do end up having to do an update to the termite report, it's typically about $150. That could be a cost that the buyer could potentially have to pay for if they don't give the seller plenty of time to deliver that. So make sure that you give them plenty of time to deliver it, and again, the typical period of time is 14 days prior to closing. And then this would be the box that you would check: seller shall pay for the inspection. And then this box here talks about how much, like a cap, if you wanted to put a cap on the cost. A regular termite inspection could be anywhere from $350 to $500 depending on the size of the home. But there are times, and I have gotten caught up into this, where we received an offer, I represented the seller, and it said actual cost. So that buyer chose to hire a entomologist who inspected the home, and I guess he apparently gets paid a lot more than the typical termite inspector, and he charged upwards of $1,000 for the termite inspection report, and I had no recourse but to pay it, because we allowed them to put in this actual cost here. But of course, if you're representing a buyer, you want to make sure that whoever you're using to do the inspection, you want to make sure that it's covered. If you were to cap it at $450 and you select a company that's going to turn out to be $550, that extra cost is going to become the buyer's expense. So make sure that you either put actual cost here, and if you are representing a seller, you might want to have a conversation with the buyer's agent on, maybe ask ahead of time, who do you plan to use, and if they're going to be wanting to use a company like Combine Termite and Pest Control or Terminix or any one of these typical termite inspection companies, you're probably going to look at somewhere close to between $350 and maybe $500 for that. But if they say something like, we're going to use someone that you've never heard of before, and he's a licensed entomologist, those people tend to charge a lot more, and that could potentially cost your seller more money. So you got to maybe keep that in mind too. The report is based on live termite infestation. So typically, if there are live termites found, it is the seller's responsibility to remedy the termite infestation, which means that they would have to either tent or spot treat depending on whatever the recommendation is of the termite inspection company. And again, that is going to be a that is going to be something that the seller will have to do per this contract. If there is any evidence of damage, visible damage done to the property, then obviously that would become an update to the disclosure, and buyer would then have to make a choice on whether or not he wants to move forward, or possibly even ask for credit if there's any kind of real damage, like maybe to beams in the ceiling that could cause the roof to cave in. It all depends on the extent of the damage, of course. And then we kind of come down here to latent or hidden termite infestation or damage. A buyer acknowledges that there may be latent or hidden termite infestation or damage of which the seller and seller's brokerage firm are not aware, and for which seller and seller's licensees make no representation. So this is really just a disclosure issue here to make sure that it is mentioned within the contract. Okay, so now we talk about Section M, condominium, cooperative subdivision, homeowner, community association documents. If you are in a neighborhood that does not have an association, the way that the board created this page here talks about whatever documents are available within that particular neighborhood should be provided to a buyer. If you are in a neighborhood like Mariners Cove or Spinnaker Isle or something like that, they do have associations that do have bylaws, meeting minutes, financials, things like that. So it's all sort of covered here. It encompasses a wide variety of documents, and it's really just whatever is available. If available, these documents are necessary to deliver to a buyer. So if you are in a neighborhood that just has CC&Rs or just declaration of protective provisions, it's okay that you are signing this section, because really it's only whatever is available. So obviously, if bylaws and amendments are not available for your particular neighborhood, you don't need to worry about providing it because it doesn't exist. But if it does exist, obviously within this section you are obligated to provide it. Now, if there is anything special that you want to add, there is a fillable box here that you could put in here. And we kind of tend to want to put in the word all applicable documents, because just on the off chance it's not mentioned here and there is something that's applicable, you might want to put it. For example, there are, specific, I guess, design guidelines in certain neighborhoods that might be a little bit different from the typical standard guidelines, and you might want to just reference that here, depending on if you know it's available. The next section talks about how long the seller has to deliver these documents. So the first box here talks about no later than so many days from the acceptance that those documents would be delivered to a buyer. So you want to try to give a good amount of time on this, because if it is an association or a condominium and documents are not easily ordered like within 4 or 5 days, sometimes these companies like Certified and DocuTreeve need time to coordinate the documents and get them in an electronic format, which could take up to 7 to 10 days. And sometimes these companies will tell you it takes about 7 to 10 days to deliver. So making sure that you have enough time to provide this to a buyer, 10 days seems to be the typical amount of time. And if for some reason you feel like it's going to take a little longer, you could put more days in here if you want to. Or you can always, when you're doing the ordering of the documents, maybe do like like an express order or something to expedite it a little quicker. Once the documents are received by the buyer, the buyer would have to acknowledge receipt of those documents within 3 days of the receipt. And that would be a typical period of time there is 3 days. It shouldn't take too long for a buyer to acknowledge that they have received it. And you want to make sure you get an acknowledgement, because depending on the delivery to the buyer's agent, you don't know what that buyer's agent is going to be doing. So you want to make sure that you know that that buyer's agent has delivered the documents to the buyer. So that's really important. The next box here is how many days the buyer has to review and approve the documents. And again, this is a period of time here that if there's something within the documents that is a deal breaker or maybe a negotiation situation, that those that should be discussed and decided within the time frame to review. So again, if you wait till after this 10 days has passed and you want to cancel based on the lack of financial information, or maybe there's some talk of association fees increases or assessments coming up, that's kind of a deal killer type of situation, you're going to want to do your canceling prior to this deadline expiring. So remember that this is very important. It's another cancellation provision for a buyer, and to make sure that it's done within the time frame, because it does pursuant to O2 of the contract. So we're going to cover that a lot more when we talk about the cancellation provisions, but make sure that when you're looking at cancellation provisions that it is that you follow through with the deadline to cancel per that section of the contract. The next box down here is how many days that the buyer has to return the documents if they choose to cancel the contract. The reason why we have this is because the documents are very expensive. They're an upwards of like about $450, could be even higher than that. If you are buying like on the marina, sometimes there are separate documents for the Marina Association as well as the actual association that you're buying into. There's two sets of documents, and Hawaii Lower Ridge is also a association that has the area, the point within Hawaii Lower Ridge. If you buy in the point, there are two sets of association documents, one for Hawaii Lower Ridge and one specifically for the point, and that could cost pretty close to about $800 to $900 just for all of that combined, and that's very expensive. So if someone were to cancel the contract and now you have to start all over with a new buyer or put the property back on the market again, that's a lot of money that the seller is out. So obviously we're going to want those documents returned to us so that we would be able to maybe provide them to a new buyer, and that way the seller would have those documents back and be able to maybe just have to buy like the meeting minutes or something like that, replace whatever's necessary if there's been a period of time from the time they were in escrow to going back on the market and going back into escrow with the new person. There may only be a couple things to swap out, which wouldn't be as expensive. So getting those documents back if someone cancels is very important, and this would be the time frame that the buyer would have to give the documents back or would be responsible for the payment reimbursement to the seller for this. Okay, so then we just kind of come down here. You can read these all pertain to the documents, but M5 is a new section in the contract which talks about electronic delivery of the documents. Sometimes instead of providing the documents, if they are available online, like some of these associations do have websites now that post all of their documents. So all their meeting minutes, financials, things like that, they're all posted on these websites. And in lieu of having to provide you with a hard copy of something, it is possible that the seller agent may just provide you with a link to the documents by way of these associations' websites, or also because it costs money and it's obviously old school to provide hard copies. Nowadays we're exchanging things through the internet, and electronic copies are more popular now than hard copies, and it's much easier nowadays to get the documents via electronically and be able to disseminate them electronically. It's much faster, quicker, and then this way we have a better way of providing several copies to several people, because typically when you have a transaction and you have these documents, several people need a copy. The seller's agent needs a copy for the file. The buyer obviously needs a copy for themselves, and then also the buyer agent may want to retain a copy for their file. So several people need copies, and to have to go down to go into your office and hand copy these huge stacks of condominium documents can be very cumbersome. And so nowadays we are doing a lot more exchanging of documents electronically. The Hawaii Association of Realtors thought it was important to now create a new section in the contract that talks about electronic delivery of documents, and everybody is in agreement that we would exchange this way. And that's why we have this section here. So we always want to make sure this box is checked. Okay, Section N, rental property matters. We did this mock purchase contract based on a non-rental situation, but since we are here, we might as well talk a little bit about it. So if the property that your client was buying was tenant occupied and the buyer is going to retain that tenant or honor the tenant's lease for however long that it is, or just wants to maintain the tenant in there as an investment, then obviously we're going to be checking N-1 rental documents, and obviously you would check all of the documents that would apply. You would want to see a rental agreement, a property condition form if it was a typical rental. If you're working with someone who is buying a vacation rental and that vacation rental is being managed by a vacation rental company, you're going to want to check off rental management contract, because you're going to want to see that contract that the current seller has with that rental vacation rental company, and you're going to need to transfer that over, and you're going to need to abide by everything that's in there, or you're going to have to make decisions on whether you're going to cancel that and move forward with a different company. But again, you have a period of time where you'll be able to review and approve these contracts and make decisions based on what you're seeing. And in that case, the seller would have a certain period of time to provide these documents to a buyer. And the next box talks about how long the buyer has to review and approve or decide what he's going to do within so many days. And that would be typically like 5 days and 5 days. And then again, if it's a comprehensive situation, a big rental, maybe it's a building, maybe you're buying a apartment building or something and you're taking on all the tenants, that might take a little bit longer. You might want to make these dates a bit longer to provide documents, and then also provide a little bit longer for the buyer to review and approve. Okay, and then obviously this next box here, it's going to be an an either or. It's either going to be a rental situation or it's not. So if you're not going to be dealing with any tenants, then obviously you would be choosing N2, delivery of possession of the property at closing. And this just says that the property is going to be delivered to the seller at closing. Obviously, if you're going to be doing any sort of rent back, the property would still be delivered to the owner at closing, but you would provide rent back instructions in the special terms section. And that's what you would do with that. Rental agreement changes during the escrow period. So let's say, for example, something has happened during the escrow with regard to the rental situation. Obviously, the seller would need to provide disclosure to the buyer, and then they would have to make decisions based on that during the escrow if that did happen. So that's what N3 talks about right there. Okay, so now we are finished with page 9 and 10 of the contract, and next we will be talking about the termination provisions. So exciting. Okay.